Okay, so Chapter 8 deals with social stratification, and by that we mean that the society is stratified into different groups or classes. So here are some of the topics that we'll discuss. So there's a variation in the degree of social inequality that we see throughout different cultures of the world. A lot of times it's tied to food getting strategy that we've discussed and the economic systems involved. So social stratification is basically when social groups such as families, classes, and ethnic groups have unequal access to important advantages. And the three advantages that the economic advantages or important advantage, not economic, but the important advantages that the book uses are economic resources, power, and prestige. So the different types of societies that the book points out are egalitarian societies, rank societies, and class societies. So we'll discuss how each of these three differ in their access to those important advantages of economic resources, power, and prestige. This is a good, table 8.1 on page 186 is a good table to refer to when it comes to giving examples of the different types of social stratification and what they all mean. So if we're going to talk about an egalitarian society, which we'll discuss each of these in more detail next, but an egalitarian society, there are no groups that have greater access to economic resources, no groups that have greater access to power, and no groups that have greater access to prestige. And a lot of times these are foraging groups and horticultural groups. So example would be the Aborigines. They are a egalitarian society that everyone, to put it simply, everyone is equal. Or there are no groups that have power or prestige or economic resources over the other. Rank societies, there is no group that has greater access to economic resources, no group that has greater access to power, but there is a group that has greater access to prestige. And a lot of times these are chiefdom societies, horticultural, complex foragers, intensive agriculture, those sorts of things can bring about. So one group has more prestige, but they don't have greater access to power or economic resources. Now, a class or a caste society, there are groups that have greater access to economic resources, groups that have greater access to power, groups that have greater access to prestige, and the United States is listed as an example, so we would be considered a class society. So again, egalitarian societies contain no social groups with greater or lesser access to economic resources, power, or prestige. So generally speaking, everyone is equal. Now, some person may get some kind of an achieved status of being known as a good hunter, but that's not something that it's that individual. It's not going to necessarily pass down. It's not a group of people. So they may have some kind of individual prestige given to them. But in egalitarian society, there's no group that has advantages in terms of economic resources, power, or prestige. In ranked societies, there is only unequal access to prestige. There's no groups that have greater access to economic resources or power. But there are some group of people that have greater access to prestige. In class society, we would say that's a fully stratified society. It's socially stratified. There are different classes of people that have different access to economic resources, power, and prestige. And these can either be open class societies or closed class societies. And what that means is, and if it's an open class society, then that means that they can move from one class to another. If it's a closed class society, and I said caste because that's considered a caste system, that means that they have no chance of moving from one caste to another. So here's a comparison of selected countries on degree of inequality in income. So that's a great indicator of social stratification. So a country like Norway, there's not a lot of, there's not really poor, really rich. There tend to be roughly the same in terms of economic abilities. Whereas a place like Haiti, there's a huge social or economic inequality that occurs. So in open class systems, there's a possibility of moving from one class to another. Now, just because a certain system is classified as an open class society, there's degrees of openness. So the book points out, and rightfully so, that even in an open class society, the chances of you moving from the class you were born into a different class throughout your lifetime is not that great. Typically, you stay in the same class. But we all know examples of someone who was, we've heard of the American dream. So, if you're born poor, you have this ability or this encouragement under the American dream to, make money, build your success, that sort of thing. And then there's also degrees of inequality. So again, we saw that with the selected countries. Some countries have very little degree of economic inequality, and some have rather large. So a caste system then is a closed system where you're born into a caste, you marry within that caste, you die within that caste. Some examples are India is probably the most common example, but the book points out others, Japan and things of that, other caste societies that maybe aren't as well known as India. So slavery has existed in various forms and times and places, regardless of race and culture, and has ranged from closed caste systems to relatively open class systems. But usually the slaves in either of those cases are, in an open class system are not afforded the same opportunities as the other classes, and more so than in a caste society. Racism is the belief that some races are inferior to others. So race is, from an anthropological perspective, is a social construct. So what is considered racism in one culture could be the complete opposite in another culture. I mean, so like say, so basically, this idea that can your race change? Yes, because it's socially constructed. That might seem kind of foreign hearing that, but it's a social construct. So, you look in the mirror and you say, our ideas of race are, I'm white or I'm black. Those sorts of things are social constructs, and so really, we've got this. So in math, you might think about continuous data. So our bodies are made up of continuous data that bring about our appearance and our physiological makeup. Well, our brains can't really handle numbers very well like computers can, so we like to break things down into categories to say that people are short or tall or white or black. Those sorts of things help our simple minds to describe humans. And so those arbitrary social classifications have consequences. So again, arbitrary but consequential. So we arbitrarily call these people white. We arbitrarily call these people black. But it's, we're all humans, and it's continuous data that make up our physical selves, and we take those and break them into categories, and depending on what category you're in, is going to impact your relationship with society. And so it's arbitrary but consequential, and times it's brought up in the social stratification chapter, because a lot of times your race, again arbitrary but consequential, will kind of determine class and that sort of thing. So here's an example from the book showing that it's an illusion that we have race categories. The diversity of human beings is so great and so complicated that it's impossible to classify, now 7 billion people of individuals into discrete races. So, taking all the people of the world and breaking them up into race categories is totally arbitrary, totally socially constructed. And again, different cultures have different ideas of race. So you may be on the losing end of racism in one culture, you go to another culture, you may be on the winning end. Arbitrary, when I say losing and winning, as the more dominant race, just based on how they arbitrarily construct race categories. So ethnicity is a little bit different in that it refers to common origins and language, such as a shared history, selected cultural differences, such as a difference in religion that characterize a group of people. So instead of a race category, there's a little bit more objectiveness or concreteness that goes along with ethnicity. So social stratification is relatively recent in human history. And we go back to our food getting strategies with foragers. Again, they're more likely egalitarian and horticulturalists, egalitarian maybe rank. But intensive agriculture, commercial agriculture, post-industrial societies, very much usually socially stratified. And so right after food production, we start to see social stratification. And we can see that in the archaeological evidence a lot of times it's based on burials. So you might have a certain plot at an archaeological site designated to certain groups of people with nice fine materials in it, like some kind of gold object or something like that. And then over here on the same site, you've got a larger, usually cemetery of people who are kind of haphazardly buried and no good, grave goods and those sorts of things. So that's how we can kind of tell if there's social stratification from an archaeological perspective. So that's chapter 8, and kind of the quick version there. I can't get these videos too long or they're hard to upload. So I hope I hit some of the important parts there, and if you have any questions, feel free to email.